Chapter 3. The two men sat in the darkest corner of the public house. Tubby Drake, the landlord of the Hog and Bucket, brought over 2 flagons of brown frothy ale. One of the men had deep-set piggy eyes, while the other was an extremely tall, thin man. The latter flicked a couple of coins onto the publican's tray and waited until he was out of earshot before speaking. "A boy, you say?" His voice was low, but precise. "Yes, Baron, and about 4 foot high." "Are you sure he's been appointed?" "He looked pretty pleased with himself when he came out." Both men took a sip of beer, and the piggy-eyed man belched. The tall thin man sighed. "Oh, please, do try to control yourself, brute." "Sorry, Baron." The landlord returned to stoke the nearby fire with logs, and prodded it until it was blazing in the grate. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the shadowy figures, "wouldn't you rather sit closer to the warmth and dry your wet clothes?" The tall thin man told him they were very happy where they were. He also added that in future would the landlord please mind his own business. Tubby shook his head, taken aback by the directness of the remark, and returned to the bar. Some customers were very rude. "What would you like me to do, Baron? I can snuff him out if you like." "Brute," the piggy-eyed man sneered. "Who, the barman?" "No, the boy from the palace." "No, don't kill this one, at least not straight away." "Pity, his neck is ripe for squeezing." "Murdering children is not my style, unless I really have to. No, put the frighteners on him, rough him up a bit and dump him in the moat." Brute grunted. "If he goes in the moat, he'll get eaten by the monsters anyway." The tall thin man finished his drink and, using a clean white starched handkerchief, delicately dabbed his mouth. "Brute, you really are an ignorant man. No such thing infests the moat. But should the boy drown, well, then that's his own affair. Now, I must go. You know what to do." "Yes, Baron." The tall thin man stood up, and keeping to the shadows, headed for the exit, almost merging with the wall. Brute swilled his ale around his odious mouth and gargled noisily before swallowing. He waited a few seconds, rubbing his rotund belly, then let rip an enormous burp. "Pardon me," he said, to no one in particular. A few minutes later he was out of the chair, and with much less subtlety than the tall thin man, he stomped to the pub door, letting it slam shut behind him. Tubby looked up from his newspaper and watched them leave. He felt relieved. These were 2 men you did not want to get on the wrong side of, especially the tall thin man. Splidge ran home and told his mother that he'd got the job and was required to work for the King of Gud straight away. He stuffed some clothes and the few home comforts he could find into a bag and explained that he needed to report to the palace within the hour. Splidge's blind mother, Maria Fabble, depended on her son for help around the house, but she was thrilled with the news. "I always said you were a clever boy," she said as she placed a home-baked pie into his rucksack. "Your sister and I will both miss you terribly." "Oh, Mum, I'll come back every weekend, I promise." "Well, make sure you do. I don't want you forgetting your family just because you live at the palace and have become all la-di-da. What are your quarters like, Splidge?" "Oh, I don't know yet, but judging from the rest of the place, they're probably cold, wet and draughty. It's all like that there." He plopped himself down onto a rickety stool next to the fire in the front parlour and gazed around the room. The decoration was sparse and the furniture meagre. He looked at the 2 upright wooden chairs. They once belonged to a barber's shop. He smiled at the sideboard with its stubborn drawers and its leg missing. Turning to the walls, he remembered rescuing the faded old paintings from the dustbins of rich people. Now they hid the cracks in the plaster. It was hardly luxurious, but it was home. "Oh, I don't want to go and live in the stinky old palace," he wailed. "Come here, you daft boy." Maria Fabble hugged her son. "It won't be so bad. Many boys live away from home with their masters in order to learn a trade. It's the way of the world." Splidge kissed his mother. "I know, Mum. It just seems so hard to leave you." "It'll be all right. I have Weenie. She's 6 now and at school and old enough to help around the house." "I love you, Mum." "I love you too, Splidge, very much. Now, off you go and do an honest day's work." Splidge had decided not to mention the painting showing his father. Talking to his mother about his father was difficult and usually resulted in them both becoming sad. Victor Fabble had left so unexpectedly, and hearing rumours that the warriors were dead was very upsetting. Maria did not believe that her husband had died, or at least didn't want to believe it, and neither did Splidge. An hour or so later, the 12-year-old hurried along the puddle-ridden streets of Gud, leaving the village of his childhood behind and making fast for his new life at the palace. He still didn't know what his role was, but figured he'd find out soon enough. Groggins was waiting for him on the drawbridge, sheltering under his trademark Hanway umbrella. Once Splidge and his bag of belongings had crossed the drawbridge, the royal butler nodded to Perch, who was sitting in his sentry box, to pull the lever. The clatter of the lifting mechanism jerked into life. The hefty oak platform rose up from the bank opposite and isolated the palace from the rest of the city. It came to an abrupt stop when upright, sealing the entrance from potential invaders. Not that anyone in their right mind would ever consider invading the dilapidated old palace. The pawnbrokers had taken everything of value long ago. The resounding echo of the drawbridge thundered in Splidge's ears, and he realised that life at the palace had begun. Regardless of what others thought, he was excited to be working for the king. "You are very lucky to have a job here, young man," Groggins told him as they made their way towards the main residence. "Yes, I know. Some of my school friends couldn't find work and were taken to the mop fair." Splidge shuddered as he remembered the auction. The mop fair was like a cattle market. Children assembled in the square, and potential employers like hotel owners, blacksmiths, chimney sweeps, tanners, shoemakers and so on would rummage through them and pick out those they thought suitable. The new masters gave the children's parents a settlement fee, often for 1 or 2 years' service, and the child worked for a pittance. However, not everyone found work, and they ended up at the workhouse, which overflowed with young people deemed unsuitable for employment. Life there was grim. It was a hated hellhole, and most of the inmates starved, ran away, or died. Splidge knew how lucky he was to have a proper job. "Will I live close to the king?" Splidge asked. It had crossed his mind that he was to be trained as a younger, sprightlier personal assistant to the great man. A replacement for Groggins, in fact. The venerable gentleman's stony face remained expressionless when he answered with an emphatic "No." "Oh." Splidge was disappointed. After a pause, he glanced up at the palace and one of the crooked towers, and optimistically signalled with his head. "Will I be up in one of those? I should like to live in an elevated apartment." The royal servant didn't even bother to turn his head. "This is where you shall reside, Master Fabble." They had stopped in front of the dilapidated remains of an old cowshed. Splidge's jaw dropped. He obviously had let his imagination run away with him. Was Groggins having a joke? The royal butler did resemble a waxwork on a day out, but under that wrinkled, flaky skin there might be a sense of humour. Yet the old man didn't smile. The weather-beaten shack was Splidge's new home. The boy's heart sank, and he realised that this was not going to be the glamorous life he had imagined after all. On the bright side, at least there were no cows in residence. Groggins unlocked the door, and with a bit of effort he managed to push it open. The rusty hinges groaned as the bottom scraped noisily against the ground. Splidge expected the door to snap clean away from its fixings, with the butler tumbling after it. "This is the only key, so please don't lose it," Groggins said. "I'll try not to." Splidge put the key carefully into his pocket and entered the cowshed. The two-roomed building was small and sparser than his family home. There was little in the way of furniture, but it was clean, and more importantly, the roof was sound. In one corner, lying across two wooden crates, were a couple of planks, and on top of them was a makeshift straw mattress. In another corner stood a battered wardrobe with fading varnish, and next to that was a low table with a ceramic washbowl and water jug. A cast-iron stove in the brick fireplace warmed the room. "You can boil water on that for washing or making hot drinks," Groggins told him. "It's lovely," Splidge said, getting used to the idea of having his own home. His friend Snotty lived in a place far worse. This would do very nicely. Groggins crossed to the wardrobe. "These are for you," he said as he reached in and placed some items on the bed. Splidge was spellbound. Laid out, freshly pressed and dazzling with newness, was a splendid array of clothes. A smart, deep purple woolen jacket and an immaculate yellow cotton shirt. There were thick brown flannel trousers and the finest pair of sturdy ankle boots he had ever seen, all polished and gleaming new. Splidge had never worn brand new clothes before. There were no holes, scuff marks, or worn patches anywhere, and they smelt divine. "Are these for me?" The royal butler smiled. "Of course they are, and there's another identical set in the wardrobe. You'll get wet when you work, so you can alternate them and hang one set in front of the fire to dry." Splidge was speechless. Clothes cost a fortune in Gud. The only new suit he'd ever seen before was the one his father wore when he left home 6 years ago. The military uniform looked very grand, but Splidge had only ever had tatty second-hand clothes. "Wow! Thanks so much. Can I try it on?" Without waiting for a response, he stripped off his mucky rags and slipped into the new suit. Groggins didn't even have time to suggest that Splidge might like to wash first, because the boy was dressed in a flash. A cracked full-length mirror adorned the front of the wardrobe, and Splidge admired himself. Everything fitted fabulously, and he twirled around with excitement. The jacket made him feel very special. "Wow, don't I look grand?" He snatched Groggins's closed umbrella and started stabbing at an imaginary beast as he darted around the room. "I'm a knight slaying a fire-breathing dragon, and I could slice a grizzly bear into 1,000 pieces dressed like this." "Well, it's a good job there are no dragons or bears in the palace. You wouldn't want to get blood all over your new clothes," Groggins said, eager to retrieve his precious Hanway. The royal butler was thrilled that the young man was so happy. Palace life needed livening up. He watched Splidge larking about, pretending to tackle hideous bug-eyed monsters and waves of evil trolls, and then he straightened himself up and moved towards the door. "I will leave you to your imaginary battles," he said. "Your evening meal is at 7 o'clock. Come to the kitchen and it will be waiting for you." "Thank you, Groggins. I will." The royal butler turned and left the cowshed, opening his umbrella as he ambled back to the palace to continue his never-ending duties. Because the royal Gud could barely walk, let alone descend the stairs of the palace, Mr. Hook, the polymath, had designed a contraption to lower the oversized monarch from his throne room, 3 stories up, down to the main hall on ground level. It was very clever. Using a series of pulleys and ropes and a very strong harness, the king could even be winched down the central palace stairwell right into his carriage when he wished to take a trip into the city. The king had decided to do exactly that, and as Splidge danced for joy in his new clothes, the royal coach trundled over the drawbridge away from the palace and clattered down the Gudian High Street. Speed was not possible thanks to the weight of its passenger. In the past, a team of 6 strong stallions could whisk the king to his destination, but he had sold them and now depended on 4 lethargic donkeys, whose only motivation to move was to reach the bunch of carrots suspended in front of their noses. Although King Guddamac always needed to save money, he couldn't be seen to drive the coach himself, as that would be demeaning. So it necessitated the employment of Gob, the royal coachman. And Gob certainly lived up to his name. Hunched up on the driver's box, sheltering from the rain under a waterproof cape, with his whip in hand, he loved to talk. King Guddamac dreaded the continual drivel that poured out of the fella's mouth every time he went on an excursion. Gob just wouldn't shut up. My wife was only telling me the other day how the taste of fish has changed over the years. She seems to think they are putting something into the river to change the flavour. Of course, I said that sounded daft. Why would they put anything into the river to do that? Surely if they wanted to make fish taste differently, they would season it whilst it was in the pan cooking. But oh no, she's not having any of my logic. She was convinced that it was a deliberate act to disguise the poor quality of the aquatic food. Of course, she never tells me who they are. As far as I know, they might be the Guild of Hideous Highland Hunchbacks, or the Swamp People from Swamp Easy. And so it went on. No matter how many times the King of Gud tapped the fellow on the shoulder and asked him to close his trap, Gob couldn't. He'd be silent for a while and then, blah, 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 out it would come, the nonsense prattle of a jibber-jabber. I notice the price of eggs have gone up, he might say. Oh, really? The king would answer. Brown ones are more expensive than white, I think because they look more organic. King Guddamac had learned to ignore him, offering the occasional ah and oh at appropriate moments. I've been thinking about knitting a scarf for my wife's birthday, but how long should I make it? I favour 6 feet, but she's keen on 3. Ah. And then there's the colour. I've got a job lot of wool from Farmer Brook, but it's black. Oh. And my Mildred says that a black scarf would look too morbid, so I really don't know what to do. It was fortuitous that Gob faced the road, away from the king, so the racket of the coach drowned out most of Gob's rambling burble. The king also pulled down his umbrella and hid beneath it in the vain hope that it would block out the chatter. It didn't. There was no roof in the coach, so an umbrella was essential, and the Royal Gud had another reason for carrying one. The homeless, starving ragamuffins of the city saw his outing as a chance to protest. The king was overfed, and they were badly undernourished, so they lobbed putrid missiles at his carriage. He used his umbrella as a shield, and, with surprising accuracy, King Guddamac managed to deflect the stinking balls of crud away, and even return them with such force that he sometimes managed to knock the perpetrators over and send them splattering into the stinking mire they stood in. That afternoon, the king was on a mission. He had good news to impart, though he feared the other party would take it badly. After enduring an hour in the bumpy coach, King Guddamac was a little apprehensive. Dealing with his half-brother was awkward at the best of times. The silhouette of the grim, smoke-belching brewery loomed as the royal coach approached. The king always found the place sinister and foreboding, and in stark contrast to the undulating soft features of the landscape that surrounded it. Being raised up on an artificial promontory added to its dominance. The architecture was bleak, and it sliced through the skyline with brutal force. King Guddamac hated it. The brewery never stopped production. Not at night, not for lunch, not ever. Only one beer was permitted in Gud, Baron's Bitter, so named after the brewery proprietor. "Come on, man," a voice shouted, and its leather-jacketed owner lashed out at a fellow carrying a sack of barley. "Get that to the mash tun on the double." The workers were encouraged to labour long and hard by a mean-looking crew equipped with vicious whips and canes, which were wielded with great enthusiasm. The officials took much sadistic pleasure in punishing anyone thought to be slacking or shirking their duties. "You boy, why haven't you licked all those labels and stuck them to the bottles yet?" "I don't feel well," whimpered a pale-faced lad, slumped over a bucket.
"You will feel a lot worse if I thrash you with this."
Crack went the whip, down went the kid, and beer labels scattered like confetti. King Guddamac didn't approve of this kind of treatment, but there were no laws to prevent overlookers from inflicting brutal beatings or cruel floggings. At the rear of the brewery, behind the Baron's palatial mansion, were acres of fields exclusively dedicated to growing barley, a crop used for making beer. Unlike normal barley, which requires plenty of sunshine, special modifications had been made to this crop so that it would mature in wet weather. It was this secret modifying that had made the Baron a very rich man. "Good morning, Your Royal Guddiness," a girl said as the royal coach pulled up outside the entrance to the brewery. "It's delightful to see you again."
"It's always a joy to see you, my dear."
The girl snapped her fingers, and half a dozen terrified workers stopped what they were doing and came to the king's aid, and, with great effort, they hauled him out of the carriage.
"I trust your father is looking after you?" the king said, when finally standing on the cobbled courtyard.
"He keeps me busy, if that's what you mean." King Guddamac smiled and followed the young lady through the brewery doors and out of the rain. There were two redeeming features which made a visit to the brewery less repugnant for the king. The first was the sweet smell of ale fermenting in voluminous oak vats. The second was the girl with the long ravened hair who worked there, and who looked after him on his visits. She was only a teenager, but the king had watched her grow up over the years. She was the Baron's daughter, yet quite unlike her father in every way. She had sparkle, charm, and great beauty. King Guddamac's half-brother lacked all those qualities. "Let me take your cape, Your Royal Guddiness, and I will have it dried for your return."
"Thank you, my dear. That's very kind."
"My father is in his office and ready to see you now." The king noticed that as the girl had grown older, she'd become more sullen, not as friendly, and spoke less. The royal Gud observed that she had hardened, and there was a certain toughness to her. These days she wore a tight, all-in-one black leather outfit and daubed herself with excessive makeup that reduced her naturally warm, glowing skin tone to a cold pallor. Evidently the Baron was grooming her well. The girl led the way. There were only 3 steps to the Baron's elevated office, but even that took a protracted effort by the royal mountain of blubber. From the murky gloom of the proprietor's domain came the distinct sound of the Baron's voice. "Brother, do come in and sit down." There was only one chair available to the king, a solitary hard-backed wooden thing. It was tiny, and the king perched rather awkwardly. Leaning back in a more luxurious chair, behind an enormous desk, sat the tall, thin man. He was playing with a small silver alarm clock. Behind him in the shadows was the large individual with the piggy eyes. "Leave us," ordered the tall, thin man. The girl with raven hair and the pig-faced brute nodded, and like ghosts they vanished from the palace. The tall, thin man leant forward and placed the clock on the desk, and in a barely audible voice he asked, "Are you prepared to sell the land I seek from you, Charles?" The king moved uncomfortably in his chair, and the seat creaked under his immense weight.
"It's lovely to see you too, Giles."
"Never mind the niceties. The funfair. Will you sell it to me?"
"You haven't said what you want it for. I cannot imagine you enjoy the laughter and amusement of little children."
"I merely wish to expand, brother. That's all." The king regarded the man opposite him for a moment. His instinct told him never to trust his half-brother.
"Expand? How?"
"The demand for my beer increases daily, and I need more space. The funfair is close to the heart of the city. It would make distribution simpler. Nothing sinister, I assure you." The royal Gud shook his head.
"Well, I'm sorry, Giles. I have no need to release that property any more. A little good fortune has come my way, and I do not require your money any longer."
The tall, thin man's body stiffened, and he fixed his cold eyes on the supreme leader of Gud. That is unfortunate news.
Actually, it's good news for Gud. I now have myself a cragflinger.
The Baron half smiled. Yes, I heard. The king frowned. His half-brother was certainly well informed, as the lad had only been appointed that morning. The Baron rose and walked to the large window which overlooked the main brewhouse. Below he could watch men emptying barley into hoppers, water into mashed tuns, and yeast into vats, where it bubbled up and dribbled over the sides. He saw an overlooker with a scar on his face chase after a worker who'd been resting against a sack of hops. Scarface cracked his leather whip at the poor man, causing blood to seep from deep lacerations on his face. The Baron smiled sadistically, relishing the punishment, and then turned back to the king, who was watching him with disgust. This is a setback for me, dear brother. I hoped you might have been more helpful, seeing that we are family and all. No matter, I shall adjust my plans accordingly.
Giles, I think the good of the nation is more important than your profit book.
The good of the nation? The Baron sneered at the king, and then he laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound.
Are you not just thinking of yourself, brother? The money from the royal tournament will help rebuild your reputation and put you back in the people's favour.
The king stood up, which was no mean feat, with anger pulsing through his veins.
Do not insult me, Giles. Yes, I admit the royal tournament will help raise money to repair the palace, but it will also put money into the pockets of the poor and needy, and the city could do with a boost too.
The Baron waved a hand dismissively. Oh, sit that huge expanse of yours down, brother, and listen. By selling that land to me, I will bring this pathetic city into the modern world. There are new ways of doing things.
Really? I doubt that. Why I ever allowed you to become the sole brewer of beer in Gud, I do not know.
Come now, you know very well the quality of ale differed before I took over. The flavour and taste varied terribly, and there were continual shortages when it was produced by those piddling small-scale artisan brewers. I have overcome those errors.
Yes, and put many skilled craftsmen out of work.
The king remained standing and glared at the tall, thin man who strutted around his office with reptilian animation. You are a backward-thinking monarch, stuck in tradition. Charles, you must be more radical if you're going to survive. I, on the other hand, am forward-thinking. My ideas of modernization, that you seem hell-bent on preventing, are the future. I will employ thousands, and people will be grateful for the work.
I've seen how you treat your employees. You'll pay a pittance, and folk will suffer, replied the king stiffly.
The people of Gud are ignorant scum, and they know no better. They wish for little. Believe me, dearest brother, they will want to work for me, be pleased to work for me, and will soon all work for me, and there is little or nothing you can do to prevent it. The tall, thin man picked up the silver timepiece from his desk. The clock is ticking, brother. You need money, and the day will soon arrive when you will have to sell me the land. The funfair is on. The king glared at his half-brother.
You are wrong, Giles. You think you have all the answers and believe that your exploitative methods are good for the city. They are only good for you and your profits. This meeting is at an end. I have told you I will not sell that land, and the games will go ahead, and that, brother, is all I have to say on the matter. Good day.
And with that, the king turned and stormed out.